Well, Joseph has made the reveal to his brothers. He's not the mean old ogre that they thought he was. He's actually their brother, the one that they had mistreated some 20 years earlier. They returned to their father to tell Jacob that their son Joseph was alive and he was in charge of Egypt. And so Joseph called for Jacob and the whole family to come out there with Pharaoh's blessing. And so that takes us to chapter 46 and verse 1. And I want you to notice something as it starts off by saying, "So Israel took his journey." And this is interesting to me, I found, because he's been Jacob for quite some time, and suddenly he's now Israel. He came to this realization in chapter 45, the end of the chapter, that God had his hand on all of this after all. And so now he's come, I think, to this realization. Remember, Israel is his God-given spiritual name, whereas Jacob often would represent his flesh nature, this guy that was the manipulator, the heel catcher, the troublemaker. Israel is now the Prince of God, is what the name Israel means. And so here he is moving in his calling, moving under the spiritual life, the new life. And I think that he represents for us what all of us need to know, and that is that our spiritual life is quite a journey. It's not something that we are automatically born again and then poof, there we are, these spiritual people. There's a journey that has to take place in our lives to where we get to a place to where we can really start trusting God as he would want of us. And Israel, or Jacob, could never really get to that point in his life. He struggled a good deal of his life trusting in the Lord. Well, now here he is at the end of his life, and I hope that it doesn't take us to the end of our lives to get that idea. For some, perhaps it will. Maybe we're slow learners, I'm not sure. But Israel is running out of time, and he finally comes to realize, I should have trusted God all along. Well, Israel took his journey. And notice it says, with all that he had. And I find that interesting. We know that phrase is talking about all of his possessions, but I'd like to think that it also meant he's all in now. He's taken all of himself and he's given himself completely over to the Lord in full trust. He has come to the place where he can say, I trust you with all of me. And I think that's why we see the name Israel being used in this verse, that he is now the one who has turned himself over. He has surrendered, as we say, completely. Now, Jacob was really put in this vice, as God tightened down on him and clamped down on his brain, so to speak, until he had to cry uncle, it seems. He had to get to the place where he just simply says, I give up. I can't win this battle against God. He always felt as if he was outsmarting God. I don't know if you've ever been in that position where you think that you can outsmart God, but you'll probably realize that you always lose that fight. It's not one you can win. You're always going to lose it. And so it's best that you throw yourself all in completely and surrender completely to the Lord. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Now, this is important, and it may seem insignificant, but if you'll remember back in Genesis chapter 21, this is where Abraham planted the tamarisk tree and offered sacrifices to the Lord there, or worship the Lord. In the end of chapter 21, it mentions what Abraham does there in this town of Beersheba. And Beersheba is always this place that it's sort of where if we could put it this way, it's almost like it's where the Jewish religion sort of began. This is where Abraham built this or planted this tree, he began offering to the Lord, sacrificing the Lord or worshiping the Lord. Isaac returned to the tree, and now we see Jacob coming back to this tree as well. Again, perhaps the indication that he was all in with God. He is now fully entrenched in his spiritual journey as Israel, not as Jacob. And the first thing that he does, he offers sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. We might also say, of course, the God of his forefather Abraham as well. He's the one, of course, who planted that tree there. So it's a significant stop on his journey out of Canaan, which is the promised land, and now into Egypt. A place, I might add, where God strictly told them, do not go into Egypt. Stay in the land. Don't leave the land. But now it appears as if God is leading them out. But chances are that Jacob was a little bit insecure about leaving the land of promise, because after all, that was to be their land. And now leaving may have been kind of like, oh, I don't know if we should do this. I'm still not completely sure. Well, after he offers the sacrifices there at Beersheba, at the roots of his faith, so to speak, we read in verse 2, then God spoke to Israel. It's after he comes to this surrender, after he says, Uncle, I give up, I'm all in, then God speaks to Israel. You know, I thought of this and I wondered, why did God wait so long to speak to his servant? Why didn't he speak to him 20 years earlier when he was grieving over the loss of his son Joseph, when he thought Joseph was dead? Why couldn't God have appeared to him then and said, oh, don't worry about this, Jacob. I've got this. Joseph's not dead. I've got another plan for him. You'll see him again in the future. No, God doesn't do that. Instead, he lets Jacob go through the agony of life. And then here, 20 years later, God seems to appear to him to comfort him. God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob, and he said, here I am. Jacob presenting himself to the Lord for service. I'm here. What would you like? And he said, the Lord said, I am God, the God of your father, or the Hebrew name El Elohim. I am the God Elohim, is what he's saying. The triune God is what we know him as. That's what the name is really talking about. I am the triune God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt. Relief. Don't worry about it. I know you're a little apprehensive. You know you're not supposed to leave Egypt. Well, I'm telling you now, you're free to go into Egypt, for, he says, I will make of you a great nation there. And I mentioned this last week, how Egypt became an incubator for the nation of Israel. And that's what God is saying here. While you are in Egypt, I'm going to make you a great nation. Not just any nation. Listen, Israel is a nation that we're still talking about today. Israel is an ancient nation. Sure, after a while, we're going to see they're going to become this great nation. They're going to rebel against God, and God is going to kick them out of their land. And then he's going to bring them back. That's what's happening now, just as he promised. He's bringing them back to their land now. They're in the land. They're occupying the land. And God is the one who's making all of this happen. Anyway, God says, I'm going to make you a great nation there. And that's exactly what he did. And he noticed this in verse 4. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again. And Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. All of these beautiful promises. I'm going to make a great nation for you. I'm going to go with you into Egypt. In other words, I'm not setting you there to be without me. No. I'm going to be with you in Egypt. And if you're going to be in Egypt, or any sort of a picture of Egypt, you better make sure God is with you, because you don't want to be in Egypt without God. Now, Egypt symbolically is a type of the world. Whenever you see Egypt, you sort of can, in your mind, you can say, oh, that's sort of like going into the world or becoming worldly. That's the significance of Egypt. And so when we see this, if you're going to live in the world, which is where we live, I don't know if you knew that, but since we live in the world, it's best to have the Lord with you. And so this is the idea, of course, I'm going with you into Egypt, so don't fear. And I will also then bring you out of Egypt again. That's what he's saying. And then this is another promise. Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. And what that means is, of course, you can imagine when someone dies, their eyes remain open. Joseph is going to close your eyelids on the day you die, meaning Joseph's going to be with you until the day you die. So this is your reward for letting me have Joseph as I develop this great plan, a plan that you know nothing at all, you knew nothing at all about. But I knew the plan. I'm working this plan. And my plan is bigger than what you can even imagine. That what I'm going to do for you as a people. And in the end, your son is going to be with you until you die. Well, then Jacob arose. That's really what he needed. He needed to hear this from the Lord. That's all he needed. And it's sometimes when we get a word from the Lord through the word of God, it's like we can stand up and then take on the world. We got it. This is from God. And so Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones, and their wives in the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. So they took their livestock and their goods, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and went to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him. So the whole family packed up, and left the land of promise and went off into Egypt. His sons, his daughters, his sons' daughters, and his daughters, and his sons' daughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. In verse 8 it says, now these were the names of the children of Israel. Now I'm not going to bore you by reading all of these names. You are certainly invited, I might say expected, to go and read them on your own if you haven't already. I'm going to instead jump down to verse 27. It's not necessary for us to know all the names of the family. What is necessary, however, and what's important, is down in verse 27, as it says that the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2 persons. All the persons of the house of Jacob who went up to Egypt were 70. So 70 persons, 72, counting the 2 who were born in Egypt, Ephraim and Manasseh were the sons of Joseph. And so here we find that 70 people actually came up from Egypt and are now came up from the land of promise and have resettled in this new land called Egypt. Well, 400 years later, 2 million Jews will be leaving. And that's the incubation process. 400 years in the making for a nation to be about 2 million strong. There are estimates. We're not really sure. We just know that there were a lot of them. So much so that the Egyptians ultimately became concerned. There's too many of them, and so we have to do something about it. Well, that comes up in a few chapters as we get into the book of Exodus. Exodus deals with what happens 400 years later with, of course, Moses, the introduction of Moses. In verse 28, then Jacob sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out before him the way to Goshen. Now, Goshen is the area of Egypt that Pharaoh suggested would be perfect for Joseph's family to settle in. And so that's where they were going, the land of Goshen. And so I think it's also appropriate that Judah is the one to lead them to safety. Judah, remember, is the ancestor to the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who will come several hundred years later, maybe even more. So, in verse 29, Joseph made ready his chariot and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel, and he presented himself to him, fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. And you can imagine what a reunion that must have been. My son, I thought you were dead, and here you are alive, and what a miracle God has worked. You have been raised up by the Lord himself. By this time, you're going to see, as we get a little further into it, that Jacob was totally into the Spirit now, in the sense that he understood this vision, this plan of God, whereas before he couldn't understand it. The problem with that, of course, is that you miss out on all of the benefits of being able to trust along the way. If we as believers are doing what we should be doing, remaining where we should remain in the Lord, then we need to be able to meet every crisis, every situation, every problem, every evil thing done against us with the mindset of, I know this hurts, but I'm going to trust God in it. I'm going to trust God in it. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but trusting the Lord through these things is really what we're expected to do. And if we do that, then we also gain the benefit of trusting in the Lord. Whereas Jacob, of course, lived nothing but misery. Remember a couple chapters ago, he said, oh, everything is against me. Everything is against me. Oh, Jacob. No, everything is going for you. It just hurts. Even when it's going for you, life can hurt. And so here they are now realizing that all of this was the plan of God. And I believe Jacob understood that now. Joseph understood it. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you were still alive. Now I'm thinking, are you kidding? You just saw each other, now you want to die. That doesn't even make sense. But it's a saying, meaning now I can go down to my grave in peace, knowing that you're still alive and I've seen you. So then Joseph said to his brothers and his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and those of my father's house who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And he's going to tell Pharaoh that my brothers, the men, are shepherds, for their occupation has been to feed livestock. So they've brought their flocks, their herds, and all that they have. So he's basically going to send the message to Pharaoh that my brothers are not coming just to mooch off the land. They have things to offer. And so that's sort of what he's saying. And so it shall be, in verse 33, that when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? That you shall say, your servant's occupation has been with livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptians, of course, were like many cultures. They kind of had their ideas or their opinions of certain groups, and they didn't like shepherds. I don't know if you know this about animals, goats and sheep in particular. They have a very distinct odor. They stink. They flat out stink. And what's worse is male goats. They have an odor that is really pungent, I guess is the word. And for most of us city folks, you wouldn't know that, but you get around them and you realize they smell. You may not know this if you are around goats, that when you walk away from them, you smell. So that's often the case, unless, of course, you do something about that. I remember when we lived in Austria, we had a fellow who was a shepherd. He used to come to church all the time, and you knew when he was with his animals because the whole room reeked of his presence. Oh, sure, we were happy to see him for the most part, but you could tell he was with his animals, and he would bring it with us. Maybe that's what they're talking about. Maybe, these people are disgusting people. Maybe that's the way they were thinking of it. But at the same time, I'm sure that they love to have goat meat or lamb. They love eating that stuff. They love the cheeses that you can get from it, I'm sure. And I'm sure that was a big part of it as well. But they didn't want to have to deal with the animals, so let someone else do it. And that's sort of where this thing is going to go. Chapter 47, then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, "My father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are in the land of Goshen." And he took 5 men from among his brothers, 5 of his brothers, and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers." Now, I'm guessing that Pharaoh loved the idea of helping Joseph's family. He liked Joseph. Obviously, he let Joseph become second in command of the whole country, in charge of this whole big project to preserve life over this 7-year famine. And so Pharaoh had incredible respect for Joseph. Yet at the same time, it's almost like we don't want freeloaders in our country. If you're going to come here and live, what are you going to contribute to our society? What do you do for an occupation? Well, we're shepherds. And they said to Pharaoh in verse 4, "We have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." And Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock." So put them to work. If they're going to be here, let's use them. Let's put them to good use. Let's use their skills, use their expertise, and let's see if we can't do something with our livestock, because you know how we hate hanging out with livestock. So we'll let them do it. That's sort of where this was going. Since they love doing it so much, we'll let them do it, and we don't have to mess with it. Well, then Joseph brought his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And notice this, I love this part. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. It's not the other way around. I mean, Pharaoh would be considered, the king. Jacob doesn't come in groveling. Maybe he came in and thanked him a bit, but Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And it appears Pharaoh received the blessing. It seems he allowed it to take place. I don't know what he would have said, how he would have said it, how he would have blessed him. I wish we would have had more details as to how that went. But I find it very interesting that Jacob took the higher position, if you will, because as Jesus said, the blessing always comes from above to those beneath. And so here is a blessing from Jacob to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How old are you?" Here must have been an age thing there that it was obvious he was pretty old. And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." In other words, I'm 130 years old, but it's a short life compared to my forefathers. They lived a lot older. So I imagine Pharaoh's scratching his head and he's thinking, wow, that's a long life. How do you live such a long life? And he said, goat cheese or something. I don't know. But here, it's a good approach to life, that the way he answers Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage. So Jacob actually sees himself as someone who's just passing through. I'm on a journey, and it won't be long that I'll be home. And that's how he sees life. We should look at life in the same way, and especially the Christian life, that we're pilgrims. We're just passing through. We're on a pilgrimage. And our pilgrimage takes us through this world, through this earth, but one day we're going to arrive home, and home to us is heaven. And so in the meantime, we do what we have to do to get to heaven, and get there and make sure that we arrive there. In verse 10, once again, Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. Like I said, I wish we could know how Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Was it words? Was it a prayer? Was it a prophecy? What was the blessing that Jacob passed along to Pharaoh? I would like to know that. But I mean, obviously there was a kindness that Pharaoh has done on the Lord's behalf. Whether Pharaoh understood it or not, Pharaoh was doing the Lord's work. You think about it like that. He was a pagan. He worshiped false gods. Yet God took this man and he used him for an extremely important part of God's plan. And God isn't afraid of doing things like that. He doesn't need just righteous people to accomplish his will. He will use whatever is at his disposal. And in case you're wondering, God is sovereign, therefore everything is at his disposal. Everything in this world is at God's disposal. And so he uses governments, he uses pharaohs and kings and governors and presidents and princes and princesses. Everybody can be used to do God's work. And it's good to remember that when we live in the crazy world that we live in today. God can use anybody at any time. And verse 11, Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. That Ramses, another way of saying the land of Goshen, or a region of Goshen, which is east of the Nile River toward Israel. But before you can get to Israel, you would have to pass through the Red Sea from where they were. That's the next book, the book of Exodus, where we'll talk a little bit about that. So they're going to be incubated in this area known as Ramses. And if that name sounds familiar, you might remember one of the old Cecil B. DeMille movies. They named Pharaoh, in one of the Moses movies, they named that Pharaoh Ramses, and some believe that it's Ramses II, but it's not likely since this happened 400 years prior to Moses. So that may be that they took the name. It looks, in the Bible, this name Ramses is not the name of a person, it is the name of a region. However, history does show us that there were a couple of pharaohs who took the name of Ramses, like maybe about 6 of them took the name Ramses. So it could be that the region came first, then the name, or the other way around, obviously. So we're not exactly sure how to take this or whether it means something, but we'll pick it up as we go through these verses. Verse 12, then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and his father's household with bread according to the number in their families. But the famine was far from being over. They weren't out of the woods yet. And so the rest of the chapter, in much of it anyway, deals with the famine. The famine is still going on. And so verse 13 says, there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Languished. The lands, both Egypt and Canaan and all the lands around there, grew weary or weak under the weight of the famine. It was so severe, which shows you why God set everyone up the way that he did, sent Joseph over there, gave him the vision, showed him how to handle it all so that he would preserve life over this time. God intentionally allowed for the famine to get that severe. Obviously, God could have sent rain. He could have done anything he wanted to. This is the way God chose to do this in order to incubate the nation of Israel. Keep that in mind. That's the main goal, was this nation of Israel. It had to become a strong nation, a strong people. And so this was all part of that plan. In verse 14, Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So remember, people would come and buy grain from Pharaoh, and that means Egyptians, foreigners. They would all come and buy grain, and they would use money. Well, apparently, the famine was so severe that they took all of the money from the people, and so by selling them the grain. And so Egypt just seemed to get wealthier and wealthier because of the planning of Joseph, the wisdom that the Lord gave to Joseph. Now all the money is in the house of Pharaoh. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed." And so here now what has happened is the government has all the money and the people had none. I think today they call that socialism, but that's a different story. This is a whole different program, if you will, that they've got all of the money. They couldn't even buy money to save themselves. Why should we die? And Joseph said, well, I'll tell you what, give me your livestock. This guy's brutal. Give me your livestock, and I will give you bread for your livestock if your money is gone. So we'll barter for the grain. And so they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the cattle, the herds, the donkeys. Thus, he fed them with bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. And obviously, if you think about it, where did all the livestock wind up? With Joseph's family, I would assume, as they were the ones who were in charge of the livestock now. So this is like a complete money swap. Everything's getting exchanged, and the nation of Israel, it seems, is going to really incubate quickly and come away with quite a bit. At least that was the idea. When the year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is gone, and my lord also has our herds of livestock. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord except for our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Why don't you buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will then be servants of Pharaoh? Give us seed that we may live and not die, and the land may not be desolate." No, it's a great idea. Look, we're dying here. Remember, when Jacob moved into Egypt, they still had at least 5 years left of this famine that they knew was coming. And so this was getting worse over time, and worse and worse and worse. They finally wind up saying, "We got nothing. We'll be your slaves. Just feed us so we don't die. We'll do anything you say." And so that's sort of what happened. And so in verse 20, Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them, so the land became Pharaoh's. And so, and then it says in verse 21, the people, as for the people, he moved them into the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end. And so they took people out of the fields and transplanted them into the cities where they could better care for them. I suppose this was like a welfare program as they gather in the larger cities. In much the same way, that's how we have it in the U.S. as well. These larger cities seem to gather people who need further assistance, and that seems to be what's happening. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations, which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their lands. Now, these priests were not Jewish priests. They didn't serve Jehovah. These were priests, they're pagan priests, and they served all kinds of idols and gods. Then Joseph said to the people, "Indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land," farm the land. So again, like he did with his own family, no free rides here. Everyone has to earn their keep. So yes, we're going to take your land. Yes, we're going to take all that you have, but we can't leave you to just be on welfare programs. Go out and work. Here's some seed. Go out and plant the seed and do something. And it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, 20% tax. 4/5 shall be your own. That will be your wage, as seed for the field and for your food and for those of your households, as food for your little ones. So this worked out fine. It was a perfect solution to this crisis. I might suggest that this is how easy a population can lose its freedom in crisis like this. And I wouldn't be surprised that we might see certain crises come against a lot of the, I guess we can call them democratic countries of the world. And at that time, I can see people throwing away their freedoms for the sake of either their securities or throwing away their freedoms for the sake of their own survival. And as a result, I think it's a dangerous situation. And if you don't have the right people in place, and I think Joseph was a right person, but we're going to see later on in Exodus that a people will rise up who did not know Joseph. And so then someone who's not Joseph is going to have a wrong motive or a wrong heart. And so they said in verse 25, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." So there, in my opinion, that's where a serious problem comes in. This is the people. This is Egypt. We're not talking about God's people, but though God's people were a part of this. Obviously, Jacob was in the middle of it all, and his family was there, and they're struggling as well. Though I think they probably made off a little bit better because they did have meat. They had their flocks, they had their herds, and they had Pharaoh's herds, and so they were going to no doubt survive this not as easily as everyone else. They were selling themselves, giving themselves over completely to Pharaoh. And notice this in verse 26. Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. And I think it's fair to say that many bad laws are enacted out of necessity. They begin out of necessity and sometimes out of a good idea or a good motive or a good plan. But laws that are bad in the hands of bad people can become terrible, which is what happens to Israel after they become so large. And we get into the book of Exodus, you'll see what happens as this turns against them very easily. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there and grew and multiplied exceedingly. So this famine helped them, whereas others were struggling. But I have to tell you, it isn't about Egypt. It's about Israel. Keep that in mind, that the nation of Israel was going to be incubated to a place of prominence in the world for centuries and centuries and centuries. And that's what God is doing here. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. That's how long he lived. So when he got there and he says, "Oh, I'm so happy to see you, now I can die." Well, he lived another 17 years, and I'm sure Joseph was very happy about that. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Now, if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt." Now, we've seen this before, the hand under the thigh. Abraham asked his servant to do the same thing. It was as if to say, "Raise your right hand and swear to me that you will do this thing for me, or that you won't let this happen to me." And so here is this idea. It's swearing an oath. Put your hand under my thigh, swear this oath to me. Please do not bury me in Egypt. I appreciate all that Pharaoh has done for me, but this is not my promised land. This is not my land. I want to go home. And that's what he's saying here. Again, there's a spiritual lesson here. Remind yourself over and over and over again, this world is not our home. It's where we are temporarily, but we're just passing through this world. It's not our home. Please do not bury me in the world, in Egypt. But let me die with my fathers, and so you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And Joseph said, "I will do as you have said." And I'm sure the reason he asks Joseph is because Joseph had the power and the authority to make that happen, whereas the other sons didn't necessarily have that same authority. We will see where the bones do end up, of course, in the promised land, just as he has sworn. And then he said in verse 31, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. And we're going to see as this chapter and as this book ends, and we're going to go next week. We have our baptism, but the following week we're going to try and cover all these three last chapters together and see if it's possible, because a lot of it is a lot of reading and different things. So read the chapters, and we'll cover it together in a couple of weeks. Lord, here's a great story of a great man, a great family, in some ways a dysfunctional family, but you chose them. There's no other way to look at it. You chose them, dysfunctional as they were. You chose them because you had a plan to save all of humanity through this family. You had a plan that included even using Egypt to protect this family, preserve this family, grow this family, so that they would be in a position to one day bring forth the Messiah. This was your plan all along. And Lord, what a great joy it is to see it unfold here in the Scriptures. Help us, when we read these things, to trust you, that you have a plan for our lives as well. So use us, Lord, for your purposes. Put us in the big picture to do our part. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.